Hi guys, so today we're going to start the media planning module. It'll be a set of 4 chapters and it's basically building on the content that we looked at in the media lecture in the preceding module and seeing how to put everything together in order to communicate the value that your brand provides its target audience or its customers. So today we're going to look at the first part of these learning objectives, and that's considering the things that we have to take into account when planning a media schedule. Then we'll, in the subsequent weeks, take a closer look at some of those media planning objectives, such as reach, frequency, and weight. Then we'll look at continuity schedules. So this is when the media plan should be rolled out, and I'll show you some typical dashboards that industry use when planning out the media schedules that they have put together in order to communicate with their target market. And then finally we'll look at some of those cost considerations. So we'll do some CPM calculations and we'll look at the difference between cost effectiveness versus cost efficiency. So what is media planning? Let's start by going back first of all and taking a broad look at marketing in general. So those of you doing the other paper I teach, which is Marketing Strategy 301, will know a lot about marketing strategy and the role that plays within sort of the greater business ecosystem within a company. So marketing strategy provides that high level impetus and direction for product and or service development, and then from that it guides obviously the type of advertising and media strategies that business might use. So we start off with a broad sort of marketing strategy because ideally that then dictates the advertising strategy. So the advertising strategy then is a slightly more narrow scoped plan in terms of what type of budget we can allocate to try to deliver on those objectives that we want in order to communicate the value that the product or service that we've created hopes to deliver to its target audience or target market. And so then from the advertising strategy, it gets even more narrower, coming down from the marketing strategy until you get to the media planning process, or sometimes it's called the media strategy. And so what that involves then is a much more specific look at the exact schedule or plan in terms of how the time and the place and the various media categories that are chosen will actually fit together at quite a tangible level in order to deliver those objectives that the advertising strategy has hopefully planned to achieve, which is in line with the overall marketing strategy, which is the thing that the business would have come up with much earlier in order to even create the products and services that it's deciding to offer. So if we think about what marketing is and the link between marketing and advertising, we know that marketing is about creating value, but also promoting value and exchanging value. And so when we talk about marketing strategy, it's more about that value creation stage. So in terms of the products or brands that we're working with 306, the Earth Initiative, sustainable toilet paper, for instance, there would have been marketing strategy in the very first place at the inception of that product. You know, they would have done research to suggest that sustainable toilet paper is a good thing to pursue, that the target market was viable in terms of its size and scope and the growth of that area. So from there, then, we now move towards the advertising strategy, which is what your project specifically looks at in terms of, okay, given that we know the marketing strategy has been done and the product is a viable option, how can we best promote the value that this product hopes to deliver, right? And then the media planning or the media strategy then looks at the nitty-gritty of how you're actually going to roll out the various media categories and the various vehicles that you might have selected in order to contact or communicate with those specific target audiences that the brand has been designed to appeal to. So what we see then is that you start off broad and you start to narrow down into this media planning, but throughout the entire process you would hope for some sort of synergy and alignment between the broad marketing strategy, down through to the more specific advertising strategy, and then down even more specifically to that highly targeted media plan. Here's another way to look at it. So on the left of the slide, you'll see that there's the marketing strategy. And then within this course, so 306 or advertising promotions, we spend a lot more time looking at the advertising strategy, right? So we've had lectures on advertising objectives, advertising budgets, creative message strategy. And now we're looking at the specific part on the right there, which is media strategy. And what is that made up of? Targeting the right audience, specifying the objectives within the media plan. So this is when we look at reach and frequency and weight. We've already looked at the types of media and vehicles that you would select. So that was in the previous module on the more general media lectures. And then finally, how you would buy different media, which we're not going to look at as much in this course because that's a very specific vocational skill that you often pick up when you are on the job. And there are various platforms and dashboards that media planners and media agencies use in the media buying process. And because those various tools change from year to year, and it's much easier for you to learn that should you be lucky enough to end up in a job with a media planning agency. So what do media planners do, since we're talking about jobs in media agencies and potentially, you know, whether or not you think you'd like to work in something like that? So as I go through these points, have a think about whether these sorts of things appeal to you as a soon-to-be graduate. So what do media planners do? So they choose the best media and vehicles for achieving a communication objective, right? So remember, that's the specific part of fulfilling the slightly more general advertising strategy and their advertising objectives, which come from the marketing strategy and marketing objectives. So are you very familiar with different types of media? Are you very familiar with various vehicles within all the different types of media? Do you have a good feel for, you know, I would use this magazine or that platform to reach this sort of person or that sort of person? If you're that sort of student and you find that type of media interaction quite enjoyable and interesting, then media planning could be for you. Media planners also have responsibility for one of the most complicated marketing communications decisions. So the way I like to think of it is you're playing a massive game of chess, and there's various pieces and, you know, different tools that you can use. So it's a bit like a big strategy game, and it's up to you to allocate those various resources you have and direct different tools and different players or game pieces in order to try and achieve some sort of outcome that you and your business partners have agreed are the best objectives to try to achieve. Aside from specific vehicles in the media, so these are the, you know, specific magazine publications or the specific radio shows or maybe the specific TV programs you want to use to position your ads in, you also have to think about the geography or the place in which those ads will appear so that you can reach the right people, but also reach them at the right locations. Right, there's no point in reaching a whole bunch of people within a certain demographic if your business partners cannot provide their product or service to those people because the shop doesn't exist in that part of the world or that part of the country. So you have to think of not only the type of vehicles you're using, but also where they may appear, depending on the type of vehicles you're using. So in other words, it's your job to find the best way to get the message, that creative message that the advertising agency has created, to the most amount of customers at the lowest cost. But these customers that you're trying to reach, ideally, should be potential customers that are ready to purchase the product. So the timing of when a person that might buy your product might see your ad and whereabouts they might see that ad are all the types of questions you'd be thinking about if you're interested in media planning. And within all that thinking, there's also the constant barrier or constraint of the budget that you have at your disposal. And so this is where it gets really strategic, because you've got a certain amount of resources in terms of, you know, you can't buy all the ad space and every single media available. You really have to pick and choose the best media, the best vehicle, the best time, the best location, and it all has to kind of come together in order to achieve those marketing objectives. So if you like that sort of idea of a job, then I'd encourage you to look further at some media planning agencies. So OMD is one of the world's largest media agencies, and I have some personal contacts there. We've managed to place some students into the OMD graduate placement program over the last couple of years, and they often have a graduate intake timed in accordance with when the university graduations happen. So if you're interested, have a look at that company, but also have a look at other media agencies and get in contact with me, and we can talk a little bit more about what a career in that profession might involve. Right, so what are the media planning steps? So there are 4 steps here. So today we're looking at selecting the target audience, and then I'll stop there, and in the subsequent lecture we'll look at specifying some of those media objectives. As I mentioned before, some of those involve looking more closely at reach as well as frequency and weight, but then there are also other objectives such as the timing, so when we would place certain ads or how you allocate budget across a year. So those are other objectives that deal with more the when of advertising. We won't look at step 3 here because we've already looked at selecting those specific media categories and vehicles in the previous module on media. And then finally, step 4 are these cost considerations. And so once again, that will be a separate lecture where we look at cost per thousand as the most common metric that media planners use, but also looking more critically at that and comparing cost efficiency versus cost effectiveness. And then I'll be tying back to a previous lecture on creative strategy to show how, the whole idea of advertising and media planning is a holistic sort of idea. It's not just about the lowest cost possible, but it's also about cost effectiveness. And creativity comes back to the fore when we look at getting maximum bang for buck. So this is what we're doing today, and we're nearly finished because it's I want to make sure we devote enough time for each of the specific components. So selecting the audience, which is one of the most important steps, obviously, of media planning, but also of advertising. You need to know who you're speaking with before you can create a message that appeals to them, and also before you know where to place certain ads and what vehicles to go for, right? So selecting the audience is very important, and there are a number of things to consider when you select your target audience. And the first is you can use buyer behavior information from either your database, so the business's database that they already may have, or from a secondary database that they may have purchased from a market research company. So understanding what they do, what these buyers do, how they behave, will then help you hopefully better target the places where these people are paying attention. You could also consider demographics. Obviously, that's a classic target audience selection criteria. Are we looking to communicate with males or females between certain age, or males between certain age, right? So demographics is a tried and true sort of criteria to consider when you're selecting your target audience. Geographics, so where they exist, is also important, particularly for small to medium enterprises, which is about 90% of New Zealand businesses. So unlike multinationals, small to medium enterprises can only service clients in specific parts of a country usually, because they're not multinational. And so geographic targeting becomes very important. As I mentioned before in a preceding slide, there's no point in having a nationwide campaign if your business cannot deliver nationwide, right? And so this is where targeting becomes very important. And certain vehicles will be more relevant to certain demographics. So if we looked at newspapers, for example, we know the weekly local newspapers such as the Central Leader or the Western Leader or the Eastern Leader have specific geographic segments within Auckland that they can target. If we look at something like social media, for instance, Facebook, you can also target based on the suburb that you want to reach out to. So geographic segmentation is another thing to consider when you're selecting your target audience. And finally, lifestyles, or another way of putting this is psychographics. So these are the habits and interests that people have that, group them in a certain way that is not necessarily restricted only to demographic or geographic. So if we look at something like, mountain bikers, for example, they actually cover quite a broad range from kids all the way to, senior citizens that still like to mountain bike. Geographically, they can also be spread out. There are various places that these people might like to hang out. And so really it's more about their interests, that lifestyle that creates a target audience on its own. Now, when you're considering all four of these things, none of those are mutually exclusive, and obviously the more of those criteria you consider, the more effective your targeting will be. But the key thing to remember is that what you want to do by selecting a very specific audience is that you can then maximize that specific audience's exposure to your ads while minimizing any wasted exposures. And this is why targeting is so important. And this is why, social media networks like Facebook are getting so popular for businesses to advertise in, is because they can very specifically target certain people, making sure that the ad only goes out to those people and aren't wasted on people that are not within that very specific target audience. The theory there being that it's no point in sending an ad out to someone that isn't in your target audience, because if they're not in your target audience, then they're probably not interested in your product or service. So you only really want to target the people that might be interested in your product or service, and using your exposure and your allocated budget in that way. Right, so next time we're going to look at those media planning objectives, specifically reach, frequency, and weight.